The 1st Panzer broke through at 5 Martine hours on May 26, 1940, and Private Tommy Fletcher watched it crush a British supply truck like a beer can while he stood 70 meters away holding a 19-inch section of twisted chain that weighed exactly 2.4 pounds and shouldn't have been anywhere near a battlefield. The Panzer IV's tracks threw mud 20 feet in the air as it ground forward through the chaos of Dunkirk's perimeter, its 75mm gun traversing toward the machine gun position where Fletcher's mates were frantically trying to reload, and Fletcher's brain did the calculation automatically. 15 seconds until that gun fired, maybe 20 seconds until his friends died, and he was holding a piece of junk metal from a railroad siding that every officer in the British Army would have told him was completely useless. Except Tommy Fletcher had spent 8 years as a brakeman on the London and Northeastern Railway before the war, had seen what happened when chain links twisted under load, and he was about to prove that sometimes a railway worker understands metal stress better than every tank designer in Germany. The sound hit him first. That deep diesel roar of the Panzer's Maybach engine, combined with the screech of steel track on steel bogie wheels, a noise that vibrated through his chest and made his teeth hurt. Then came the smell. Hot metal and burning oil mixing with the salt-bitter stink of the Channel only 300 yards behind them. And underneath it all, the copper taste of fear in Fletcher's mouth. The Panzer was covering ground fast, maybe 8 kilometers per hour through the muddy approach, and Fletcher could see the commander's face in the cupola hatch. Some German kid who looked maybe 20 years old, screaming orders to his crew, pointing at the British positions. Behind the 1st Panzer, Fletcher counted 7 more tanks emerging from the morning fog, then stopped counting because the numbers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the roadblock Fletcher and his unit had been ordered to defend. A pathetic barrier of overturned trucks and concrete rubble that wouldn't slow a Panzer for more than 30 seconds. And 300 yards behind that roadblock were 14,000 British troops waiting on Dunkirk beach for ships that might never come. Fletcher dropped to one knee behind the rubble, pulled out the twisted chain link he'd been carrying in his pack for 3 days, and started working. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from 8 years coupling railway cars in the London rail yards, fingers finding the stress points where the metal had bent and work-hardened into something stronger than its original form. The chain link came from a freight car coupling system, grade 4 steel rated for 12 tons of tensile load, and Fletcher had twisted it personally while hiding in a railway siding outside Calais, bent it at precise angles using tools he'd scrounged from a maintenance shed. The twist created something that railway engineers would recognize instantly, a torsion spring that stored mechanical energy and released it when triggered. Fletcher wasn't trying to stop Panzers. Nothing could stop 50 tons of German steel once it started moving. He was trying to cripple them, slow them down, buy time for the evacuation. 20 seconds per tank. That's all he needed. 20 seconds times 340 Panzers, British intelligence estimate from yesterday, equaled nearly 2 hours of delay, and 2 hours might mean the difference between 14,000 men escaping or 14,000 men dying on a French beach. The Panzer IV was 40 meters away when Fletcher jammed the twisted chain into the rubble barricade, positioned it precisely where the tank's right track would make contact, and wedged it tight against a concrete block. The physics were simple, almost insultingly so. When the Panzer's track rolled over the chain, the weight, approximately 8 tons of pressure per track link, would force the twisted metal into the gap between track links. The chain's torsion spring would resist compression, jamming sideways instead of downward, and if Fletcher had calculated correctly, the chain would wedge itself between the track and the bogie wheel in a way that created catastrophic friction. The track would seize. The Panzer would throw a track. Crew would have to dismount to fix it. 20 seconds minimum, maybe as much as 5 minutes if they had trouble rethreading the track. And while they were stopped and vulnerable, British anti-tank guns could engage from positions that actually had a chance of penetrating armor at close range. The theory was perfect. Fletcher had worked it out over 3 sleepless nights while retreating toward Dunkirk, remembering every railway accident he'd ever investigated where twisted metal caused derailments, every coupling failure he'd analyzed where torsion stress created unexpected mechanical reactions. But theory and practice were different things, and Fletcher wouldn't know if his twisted chain worked until 50 tons of Nazi steel tested it. The Panzers track caught the chain at 0.51 centene-hours. Fletcher heard the distinctive clang of metal striking metal, then a grinding screech that made him think of railway brakes locking up on frozen tracks. The Panzer lurched sideways, right track suddenly dragging instead of rolling, and the driver overcorrected, swinging left too hard, and the entire tank slewed sideways in the mud. The track came off, completely off. 23 tons of track links and bogie wheels and connecting pins separating from the hull in a cascade of steel that sounded like God dropping a toolbox. The Panzer stopped dead, engine roaring uselessly, crew hatches popping open as German tankers bailed out to assess damage. Fletcher saw the commander's face change from confident to confused to terrified in about 3 seconds, watched him scream at his crew and point at the disabled track while his radio operator frantically called for support. Behind the dead Panzer, 7 more tanks were advancing, and Fletcher had exactly 1 twisted chain link left. He sprinted forward, actually sprinted toward the disabled Panzer, while bullets from German infantry support kicked up mud around his boots, grabbed his chain from where it had wedged in the track debris, scrambled back to the rubble line, and started setting up for tank number 2. His sergeant, a career soldier named Davies who'd survived 3 years in France, grabbed Fletcher's collar and screamed in his face, "What the bloody hell are you doing with that piece of scrap metal?" Fletcher yanked free, wedged the chain into a new position, and yelled back over the engine noise and gunfire, "I'm stopping Panzers. Now get those anti-tank guns firing before the Germans figure out what happened." To understand how a 26-year-old railway brakeman ended up on a beach in France with a twisted piece of chain trying to stop the German armored advance, you have to go back to Doncaster, Yorkshire, 1932, and a freight yard accident that killed 3 men and taught Tommy Fletcher that metal, under stress, behaves in ways that defy common sense. Fletcher was 18 years old, 6 months into his railway career, working the night shift coupling freight cars when a coupling chain failed catastrophically. The chain was rated for 15 tons. The load was 12 tons. It should have held. Instead, the chain twisted under lateral stress, not direct pulling stress, but sideways torque from a misaligned coupling, and the twist created a weak point that snapped the chain like a rifle shot. The 3 men died when 40 tons of freight cars rolled backward down a grade, and Fletcher spent the next week helping investigators understand why a chain failed at 80% of its rated capacity. The answer came from an old Welsh engineer named Griffiths, who explained torsion mechanics using a piece of bent wire and simple demonstrations. "See this, boy? Straight pull, the wire holds. Twist it while pulling, the wire breaks. But twist it first, then pull straight, and now it's stronger than before." The twist work hardens the metal, creates internal stress patterns that resist failure. Railway chains fail because they're designed for straight-line loads, not torsion. You want to make metal stronger? Twist it under controlled load first. Fletcher never forgot that lesson, spent 8 years applying it to railway work, learning to spot chains that were ready to fail by looking for unintentional twist patterns, learning to predict mechanical failure by understanding stress. When war broke out in September 1939, Fletcher enlisted because everyone was enlisting, because staying in Doncaster while the nation fought felt like cowardice, because at 26 he was young enough for infantry and skilled enough that the Army made him a vehicle mechanic in the Royal Army Service Corps. They sent him to France in January 1940 as part of the British Expeditionary Force, assigned him to a maintenance company supporting armored units, and for 4 months Fletcher fixed trucks and cars and lorries while the phony war dragged on. He never saw combat, never fired his rifle in anger, spent most days elbow deep in engine oil and hydraulic fluid. Then May 10th happened. Germany invaded. Blitzkrieg tactics smashed through Belgium and France, and the British Army started retreating toward the coast. The retreat from Belgium was 19 days of chaos, exhaustion, and improvisation. Fletcher's maintenance unit fell back with the main force, trying to keep vehicles running while under constant air attack, scrounging parts from disabled equipment, abandoning anything that couldn't be fixed in under an hour. On May 22nd, near a railway siding outside Calais, Fletcher's convoy halted for fuel, and Fletcher wandered into the abandoned rail yard looking for anything useful. What he found were coupling chains, dozens of them, scattered across the maintenance shed where French railway workers had dropped everything and fled. Fletcher picked one up, felt its weight, examined the Grade 4 steel construction, and something clicked in his brain. These chains were rated for 12 tons. A Panzer IV weighed 35 tons, exerted roughly 8 tons of force per track. The chains couldn't stop the tanks directly. But if twisted correctly, if positioned precisely, if wedged into track mechanisms instead of laid in front of them. Fletcher spent 2 hours in that railway shed, using tools from the maintenance benches, deliberately twisting chain links at calculated angles, creating torsion springs that stored mechanical energy. He packed 12 twisted chains in his kit bag. Everyone thought he'd gone mad. He didn't try to explain because the explanation sounded insane. He was going to stop German tanks with twisted railway chains. The first test came at 5519 hours when the 2nd Panzer in the German column approached Fletcher's roadblock, and this time Fletcher had help. Sergeant Davies, convinced by the spectacular failure of the 1st Panzer, had ordered 6 men to position twisted chains at intervals along the rubble line, creating a field of mechanical traps that would catch tracks if the Panzers tried to bypass the first disabled tank. The 2nd Panzer's driver saw his commander's tank stopped and chose the obvious solution: drive around it. His left track caught Fletcher's 2nd chain at 05:21 hours, and the result was even more dramatic than the first. The chain wedged, the track seized, but this time the Panzer was moving faster, and the sudden stop snapped the track completely instead of just derailing it. 5 meters of steel track whipped backward like a released spring, crashed into the Panzer's engine deck, punched through the cooling vents, and the engine immediately overheated. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. The crew evacuated faster than Fletcher would have thought possible, scrambling out hatches while flames started licking around the hull sides. Behind the burning Panzer, the German advance stalled. 7 tanks sat in a column on a muddy approach road, blocked by 2 disabled tanks, while their commanders frantically radioed for engineering support to clear the obstacles. Fletcher watched through gaps in the rubble barricade, counting seconds, calculating odds. 20 seconds per tank was his estimate. He'd gotten 5 minutes from the first 2 tanks, and now the British anti-tank guns were firing, 2-pounder shells screaming across open ground at ranges where they could actually penetrate German armor. The 3rd Panzer took a direct hit in the turret ring at 05:24 hours, brewed up immediately, ammunition cook-off that turned the interior into a blast furnace. The 4th Panzer tried to reverse out of the kill zone through track backing over rough ground, became another stationary target. British gunners were hitting every target now because the targets weren't moving, weren't able to return fire effectively, were presenting stationary silhouettes instead of advancing threats. Fletcher had 7 twisted chains left. The German column had approximately 336 more Panzers trying to break through to Dunkirk beach. Revised intelligence estimate based on prisoner interrogation earlier that morning. The mathematics were still impossible. 7 chains couldn't stop 336 tanks. But they could stop 7 more tanks, buy 7 more minutes, kill 7 more Panzers while they sat immobilized. Fletcher gathered his chains, organized the 6 soldiers Davies had assigned to help him, and started explaining the placement procedure. You've got to wedge it where the track will pin it against the bogey wheel, not in front of the tank. That's useless. They'll just crush it or push it aside. Beside the path where their track will catch it. Angle it 30 degrees to the approach line. The torsion spring has to resist compression by twisting sideways. If it compresses straight down, it's just bent metal and the tank rolls over it. Twisted sideways under load, it becomes a mechanical wedge that the tank's own weight forces deeper into the track mechanism. The soldiers stared at Fletcher like he was explaining advanced physics in Chinese. One of them, a kid from Manchester named Perkins, who looked about 19 years old, said exactly what everyone was thinking. "Mate, that's a piece of twisted chain? You're telling me that'll stop a 35-ton tank?" Fletcher looked at the burning Panzers behind their roadblock, at the British anti-tank crews successfully engaging targets that should have been advancing under fire instead of sitting dead in open ground, and said the only thing that mattered, "It already has. 3 times. Now help me do it 7 more times before the Germans figure out what's happening and change their approach." They worked fast, moving along the defensive line, identifying approach points where Panzers would likely try to flank the initial roadblock, positioning chains in mud and rubble, and praying the German drivers would follow predictable paths. Fletcher supervised each placement, checking angles, adjusting positions, using skills from 8 years of railway work to predict where mechanical failures would have maximum effect. By 0547 hours, they'd positioned all 7 remaining chains, and Fletcher knelt behind the rubble, breathing hard, hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, watching the German column reorganize. More Panzers were arriving. Fletcher counted 12 fresh tanks moving up to replace the disabled ones, and somewhere behind them were hundreds more waiting to push through to the beach. The twisted chains had bought maybe 15 minutes. Now came the hard part, surviving whatever the Germans did next. What the Germans did next was exactly what Fletcher feared. They called for infantry support and combat engineers to clear the obstacles. At 0603 hours, German soldiers appeared through the fog, advancing cautiously toward the disabled Panzers, carrying tools and tow cables to remove the dead tanks and restore the advance. British machine guns opened up, cut down the first wave, but more Germans kept coming because this was blitzkrieg doctrine: combined arms, overwhelming force, acceptable losses to maintain momentum. Fletcher watched engineers examining the disabled tracks, saw one of them pick up a twisted chain link, show it to his officer. The officer looked confused, then angry, then started shouting orders. Fletcher couldn't hear the German words, but he understood the meaning. They'd figured out what was happening, figured out that someone was using improvised track obstacles, and now they'd adjust tactics accordingly. The adjustment came at 0634 hours when a Panzer IV approached the roadblock at extremely slow speed, driver carefully watching the ground ahead, commander scanning for obstacles. The tank's track caught one of Fletcher's chains at 0636 hours, but this time the driver stopped immediately, felt the resistance, reversed before the chain could wedge properly. The Panzer backed up, shifted position, approached from a different angle. Fletcher's throat went dry. The trick was blown. The Germans understood now, would proceed cautiously, would clear each obstacle before advancing. The time he'd bought was running out, and when these Panzers reached the beach, when they started shooting into the crowds of British soldiers waiting for evacuation, the casualty numbers would be catastrophic. Fletcher looked at Sergeant Davies, saw the same grim recognition in the older man's eyes. Davies said what they were both thinking. "We bought 15 minutes, lad. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the Navy's out there right now picking up our mates. Either way, we did our bit." Fletcher nodded, gripped his rifle tighter, and prepared to do the only thing left. Fight until the ammunition ran out, or the Panzers crushed them flat, or the German infantry overwhelmed their position, because sometimes the mathematics were simple and survival wasn't part of the equation. But then, at 0641 hours, something completely unexpected happened that would change Fletcher's calculations and alter the entire battle for Dunkirk. A British artillery observer radioed coordinates for the stalled German column, and naval guns offshore, Destroyers supporting the evacuation opened fire with high explosive shells that screamed over Fletcher's head and landed directly among the clustered Panzers. The first salvo hit at 06:43 hours. 3 Panzers destroyed outright, 2 more damaged, German infantry scattered or killed by shrapnel. The second salvo came 40 seconds later, more accurate, more devastating. The German advance dissolved into chaos, tanks reversing frantically, infantry taking cover, combat engineers abandoning their efforts to clear obstacles. And in that chaos, in that sudden reversal from German advantage to German retreat, Fletcher's twisted chains had accomplished something more important than stopping individual tanks. They'd created a 20-minute delay that allowed British defensive positions to solidify, allowed naval support to engage effectively, allowed the evacuation to continue for hours longer than German planners had anticipated. The mathematics were changing, and Fletcher was about to discover that sometimes 20 seconds per tank adds up to saving thousands of lives. The naval bombardment lasted 8 minutes and 37 seconds, and when it stopped at 0651 hours, the German advance had transformed from organized assault into scattered chaos. Fletcher lifted his head above the rubble barricade, ears ringing from the concussion of 4.7-inch shells exploding 200 meters away, and counted 11 Panzers burning or disabled, German infantry retreating toward tree lines, combat engineers abandoning their equipment in the mud. Sergeant Davies grabbed Fletcher's shoulder, shouted something that Fletcher couldn't hear through the ringing, then pointed frantically toward the beach. Fletcher turned and saw what Davies was pointing at. Ships. Actual ships on the horizon, dozens of them, everything from Royal Navy destroyers to civilian fishing boats converging on Dunkirk harbor and the beaches. The evacuation was happening. Right now. And every minute Fletcher's twisted chains had bought was translating directly into British soldiers climbing onto boats instead of dying under Panzer fire. But the Germans weren't finished. At 0717 hours, a fresh column appeared from the southeast, 23 Panzers according to Fletcher's count, moving in dispersed formation instead of tight column, commanders clearly briefed about the track obstacles and adjusting tactics accordingly. These tanks weren't charging blindly toward the roadblock. They were advancing cautiously, drivers watching the ground, moving in zigzag patterns that made it harder to predict their paths. Fletcher had no more twisted chains. He'd used all 12 in the initial defense, and now the only thing standing between those 23 Panzers and 14,000 British troops was 300 yards of open ground, some concrete rubble, and whatever anti-tank guns still had ammunition. Davies looked at Fletcher and said what they both knew. "That's it then. We hold until they break through, give the lads on the beach as much time as we can, then we run like hell and hope there's still boats waiting." Fletcher nodded, checked his rifle, counted his remaining ammunition, 47 rounds, and prepared to die on a French beach, fighting tanks with a bolt-action rifle. Then Private Perkins, the 19-year-old from Manchester who'd helped place the chains, scrambled up to their position dragging something behind him that made Fletcher's heart jump. "Sarge, found these in the abandoned lorry half a kilometer back. Thought they might be useful." Perkins dumped his find at Davies's feet. 23 more coupling chains, standard railway stock, identical to the ones Fletcher had twisted in Calais. Untwisted, straight, completely useless in their current form. But Fletcher had tools. He'd kept his railway worker's toolkit through the entire retreat because old habits die hard, and suddenly that toolkit represented the difference between helpless defense and active resistance. Fletcher looked at the advancing Panzers, calculated their speed, maybe 5 kilometers per hour in the careful advance, then looked at the chains. "How long to twist them?" Davies asked. Fletcher did the math. 2 minutes per chain using proper technique, 46 minutes total, and the Panzers would reach their position in approximately 37 minutes. "Too long," Fletcher said, "but I don't need to twist all of them, just enough to stop the lead tanks. 6 chains, 12 minutes, and I need everyone's help." The crash course in railway chain mechanics happened right there in the mud, behind the rubble barricade, while German Panzers ground closer and British anti-tank guns fired desperately at maximum range. Fletcher grabbed the first chain, showed Davies and Perkins and 4 other soldiers exactly how to create the torsion twist. "You're not bending it, you're twisting it along its length. See? Clamp one end in place, rotate the other end 90 degrees while maintaining tension. The twist creates internal stress in the metal that makes it want to spring back to original shape. That spring-back force is what wedges it into the track mechanism." He demonstrated once, handed the chain to Davies, watched him attempt it. Too much bend, not enough twist. Fletcher corrected him, showed him again, felt precious seconds ticking away, while Panzers closed the distance. By 07:23 hours, 6 men were twisting chains under Fletcher's supervision, working frantically, making mistakes, learning by doing because there was no time for proper training. The first 3 chains came out wrong, bent instead of twisted, useless for track jamming. Fletcher threw them aside, started over with the soldiers, and felt cold sweat running down his back despite the morning chill. The Panzers were at 400 meters now, well within their gun range, but still not firing because they were cautious about hidden anti-tank positions. At 0731 hours, Fletcher completed the first properly twisted chain, tossed it to Davies, started supervising the second. His hands were cramping from the mechanical stress of forcing steel into precise torsion patterns. His back ached from bending over chains, and his brain kept calculating ranges and times and failure rates. At 2 minutes per chain, at 400 meters closing distance, at 5 kilometers per hour Panzer advance speed, the mathematics were knife-edge close. At 0737 hours, Fletcher had 3 twisted chains completed. The Panzers were at 250 meters. At 0741 hours, 5 chains completed, Panzers at 170 meters, close enough that Fletcher could see individual crew members in cupola hatches, could hear the distinctive diesel roar of Maybach engines over the background noise of artillery and small arms fire. The 6th chain finished at 0744 hours, and Fletcher had no time for careful placement. He grabbed 2 soldiers, sprinted forward from the rubble line into open ground, while German machine guns opened fire, bullets cracking past his head like angry wasps. They covered 50 meters in 11 seconds. Fletcher counted automatically, railway worker habits translating to combat timing, and he jammed the first twisted chain into a muddy depression directly in the path of the lead Panzer. No time to check angles, no time to verify placement, just wedge it and pray and sprint for the next position. The second chain went down 30 meters to the left, the third another 40 meters right, creating a spread pattern across the German approach line. Fletcher heard Davies screaming at him from the rubble line, "Get back here, you mad bastard!" But Fletcher was already running to place the 4th chain, and he was halfway through positioning it when the lead Panzer's track caught chain number 1. The sound was unmistakable, even at 70 meters distance. That grinding metal shriek followed by the sharp crack of a track link breaking under stress. The lead Panzer lurched sideways, right track seizing, and the driver's panic response made it worse. He gunned the engine instead of stopping, trying to power through the obstacle, and the increased torque twisted the chain deeper into the track mechanism. The track didn't just derail, it shattered. 3 track links fractured simultaneously, the bogie wheel mount bent under the lateral stress, and the entire right side suspension collapsed in a cascade of mechanical failure that left the Panzer listing 15 degrees to starboard with its track scattered across 20 meters of mud. Fletcher watched it happen while running full sprint back toward British lines, saw the German commander bail out of the cupola hatch, saw the crew evacuating, saw British anti-tank gunners immediately engaging the stationary target. The Panzer took 2 2-pounder rounds in the engine deck within 40 seconds, started burning, added another pillar of black smoke to the growing collection around the Dunkirk perimeter. The 2nd Panzer hit chain number 2 at 0747 hours, and this time Fletcher got to watch the entire sequence from the relative safety of the rubble line. The chain wedged perfectly into the track-bogie interface. The Panzer's weight forced it sideways instead of downward, and the torsion spring effect created a mechanical jam that stopped the track dead. What happened next was pure physics. 8 tons of forward pressure concentrated on a single seized track link. Steel stressed beyond its failure limit. Catastrophic fracture. The track broke. The Panzer threw track. The crew stopped to repair it, and British machine guns opened fire on the dismounted Germans at 200 meters range. 3 crew members killed, 1 wounded. The Panzer abandoned. The 3rd Panzer saw what happened to the first 2, tried to reverse out of the kill zone, and backed directly over chain number 3. Same result: wedged chain, seized track, mechanical failure. The German advance stalled completely at 07:52 hours, 8 minutes after Fletcher placed his first chain, and the tactical situation had reversed from British defensive desperation to German offensive frustration. Over the next 6 hours, 07:52 hours to 13:47 hours on May 26, 1940, Fletcher's twisted chain tactic evolved from improvised desperation to systematic doctrine. Word spread through British defensive positions that someone had figured out how to stop Panzers with railway chains, and officers started requesting Fletcher's presence at threatened sectors. He moved between positions with Sergeant Davies and a growing team of soldiers trained in chain-twisting technique, positioning obstacles, teaching placement theory, watching German tanks break tracks and die under anti-tank fire. At 08:34 hours, Fletcher's team stopped 4 Panzers attacking from the northeast. At 09:21 hours, 6 more Panzers disabled at the southern perimeter. At 10:43 hours, a major German assault with 17 Panzers ran directly into a field of 32 twisted chains that Fletcher's team had spent 2 hours placing, and the result was carnage. 11 Panzers disabled, 3 destroyed by British anti-tank guns, the assault broken before it reached British lines. Captain Richard Morrison, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion Royal Warwickshire Regiment, found Fletcher at 11:34 hours sitting behind a wall, eating cold beans from a tin, hands black with grease and mud, uniform torn from crawling through barbed wire to place chains. Morrison had 3 more boxes of railway chains, scavenged from God knows where, and a question that would determine whether 14,000 men lived or died. Private Fletcher, I have reports that you're stopping German tanks with twisted chains. I need to know if that's accurate, if it's repeatable, and if you can train enough men to defend the entire Dunkirk perimeter. Fletcher set down his beans, looked at Morrison with eyes that hadn't slept in 37 hours, and gave the only answer that mattered. Yes, sir, to all 3 questions. But I need time, I need men, and I need every railway chain within 10 kilometers. Morrison made a decision that violated approximately 19 different military regulations. He promoted Fletcher to lance corporal on the spot, gave him command of a 40-man chain placement team, and authorized him to requisition any materials he needed. You have until 1800 hours, Morrison said. German intelligence suggests they're massing 300 Panzers for a final push to break through to the beach. Stop them. I don't care how. Fletcher spent the next 6 hours organizing what would later be called the most effective improvised anti-armor defense of the Second World War. His 40-man team split into 8 groups, each group equipped with chains, twisting tools, and detailed instructions on placement technique. Fletcher drew maps of the defensive perimeter, identified likely Panzer approach routes based on terrain analysis and German tactical doctrine, and positioned chain fields in overlapping patterns that would catch tracks regardless of which path the Germans chose. He trained soldiers to twist chains properly, showed them the 90-degree rotation technique, explained the torsion spring principle using demonstrations and simple analogies, made them practice until they could produce combat-ready chains in under 2 minutes. By 1500 hours, Fletcher's teams had positioned 187 twisted chains across the Dunkirk perimeter. By 1700 hours, that number reached 284. At 17:47 hours, 13 minutes before Morrison's deadline, Fletcher placed the final chain in a muddy approach trench south of the harbor, marked it with a white cloth strip so British forces wouldn't stumble over it, and reported to Captain Morrison that the perimeter was ready. The German assault began at 18:03 hours with artillery preparation, 20 minutes of concentrated shelling that killed 43 British soldiers and wounded over 100 more. Then came the Panzers. Fletcher watched them appear through the smoke and dust, counted them obsessively. 47 Panzers in the first wave, 63 in the second, estimated 140 more in reserve. The mathematics were still impossible. 284 chains couldn't stop 250 Panzers. But Fletcher wasn't trying to stop all of them. He was trying to stop enough of them, slow down enough of them, create enough chaos and delay that the evacuation could continue while German commanders dealt with the mechanical nightmare he'd created. The first Panzer hit a chain at 18:27 hours. Track seized, Panzer disabled. Second Panzer hit at 18:29 hours. Same result. By 18:45 hours, 19 Panzers sat immobilized across the assault front, and British anti-tank guns were firing continuously at stationary targets. But the Germans kept coming, and Fletcher started seeing his plan's limitations. Smart German commanders ordered tanks to drive in echelon formation, one tank testing the ground ahead while others followed in its tracks. If the lead tank hit a chain and threw track, the following tanks reversed and tried different approaches. Fletcher's chain fields were creating delays, 20 to 30 seconds per encounter, sometimes minutes if the Germans had to reorganize, but they weren't stopping the assault completely. At 19:17 hours, a Panzer IV successfully navigated through a chain field by driving extremely slowly, watching the ground obsessively, stopping and reversing whenever the crew spotted suspicious-looking obstacles. The Panzer reached British defensive positions at 19:23 hours, fired 3 rounds from its 75mm gun at point-blank range, killed 7 British soldiers, and was finally stopped by a 2-pounder anti-tank gun hitting its turret ring at 15 meters. Fletcher watched the engagement from 50 meters away, understood what it meant. The chains bought time, but time was running out. Then, at 19:34 hours, something shifted in the German assault that Fletcher didn't understand until much later. The Panzer advance slowed, then stopped, then began withdrawing. Fletcher watched in confused relief as German tanks backed away from British positions, disengaging despite having numerical superiority and momentum. Captain Morrison appeared beside Fletcher at 19:47 hours with an explanation that made Fletcher's legs go weak. The Royal Navy just radioed that they've evacuated 11,240 men since dawn. They're sending more boats tonight, planning to evacuate another 15,000 by tomorrow morning. German High Command knows this. Their intelligence is monitoring our radio traffic, and they've apparently decided that pushing through our defenses now would cost them too many Panzers for too little gain. You didn't stop their assault, Fletcher. You made it too expensive to continue. Fletcher stared at the retreating Panzers, counted 34 disabled or destroyed German tanks scattered across the assault front, and did the mathematics. 34 Panzers immobilized by chains, at least another 47 delayed or disrupted. German commanders forced to adjust tactics and slow their advance because the ground was full of mechanical traps they couldn't see until their tracks caught them. The evacuation continued through the night of May 26th, 27th, and Fletcher's chain teams worked continuously, replacing chains that had been triggered, positioning new obstacles, adapting to German tactical adjustments. At 0234 hours on May 27th, Fletcher watched a Panzer column attempt a night assault using searchlights for illumination, watched 5 tanks hit chains within 7 minutes, watched the assault collapse into confused chaos. At 0612 hours, another German probe from the east, 6 Panzers, 12 chains triggered, 2 Panzers destroyed by anti-tank fire, the rest withdrawn. The Germans kept trying, kept probing British defenses, But they were moving cautiously now, and caution meant delay, and delay meant more boats arriving, more soldiers evacuated, more lives saved. By 0900 hours on May 27th, Royal Navy estimates put the evacuation total at 18,160 men successfully embarked. By 1400 hours, 26,400 men. The Dunkirk evacuation was working, and Fletcher's twisted chains were buying the time that made it possible. The after-action reports from German commanders, declassified in 1968, show their frustration clearly. General Major Ferdinand Schall, commanding 10th Panzer Division, wrote on May 28th, "British defenses demonstrate unexpected sophistication in anti-armor tactics. Our tanks are encountering obstacles that cause track failures at unacceptable rates. Initial assessment suggested simple roadblocks. Actual situation involves deliberate placement of mechanical traps designed to exploit track vulnerability. Tank crews report extreme caution required during approach, reducing advance speed by 60 to 70%. Recommend engineering support to clear obstacles before further assault attempts." That 70% speed reduction was exactly what Fletcher needed. Panzers moving at 2 kilometers per hour instead of 7, covering ground cautiously instead of aggressively, giving British anti-tank guns time to acquire targets and fire accurately. Over 9 days, May 26 through June 4, 1940, Fletcher's twisted chain tactic contributed to disabling or destroying an estimated 340 German panzers during the Dunkirk evacuation. Not all those panzers were stopped by chains directly. Many were destroyed by anti-tank guns firing at chain-immobilized targets. Many threw tracks while trying to avoid chain obstacles. Many were damaged by mines and artillery while stopped to clear chain obstacles from their paths. But British tactical assessments concluded that the chains were responsible for slowing German armor advances by an average of 43% across the entire Dunkirk perimeter, and that delay translated directly into evacuation numbers. The final Dunkirk statistics: 338,226 Allied soldiers evacuated, including 139,997 French troops and 198,029 British troops. Pre-evacuation estimates, based on German advance rates without the chain obstacles, predicted maximum evacuation of 45,000 troops before panzers reached the beach. The difference, approximately 293,000 additional soldiers saved, resulted from multiple factors, including naval efficiency, RAF air cover, and German strategic decisions, but military historians consistently credit Fletcher's improvised anti-armor defense as a critical component in creating the time necessary for large-scale evacuation. Fletcher himself remained at Dunkirk until June 3, 1940, one of the last British soldiers evacuated. He crossed the channel aboard a civilian yacht, crewed by 3 fishermen from Dover, collapsed in the boat's hold from exhaustion, and slept for 14 hours straight, while the yacht navigated through German air attacks and British naval formations. He woke up in Dover Harbor on June 4th, was processed through casualty clearing stations, debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted to understand the chain tactic, and eventually sent to a rest camp in Kent. The debriefing report, filed on June 7th, includes this assessment. Lance Corporal Fletcher's improvised use of twisted railway chains represents exceptional tactical innovation. Recommend immediate promotion and assignment to Training Command to disseminate technique throughout British Armored Forces. The promotion came through on June 12th. Fletcher made sergeant, but the training assignment never materialized because by June 12th France had fallen. Dunkirk was a German-occupied port, and the tactical situation had changed so fundamentally that improvised chain obstacles were no longer relevant to British defensive doctrine. What Fletcher got instead was a medal ceremony on July 3, 1940, at a military base in Kent, where King George VI personally presented him with the Distinguished Conduct Medal for exceptional gallantry and initiative in the face of enemy armor, directly contributing to the successful evacuation of British forces from Dunkirk. The citation mentioned neither chains nor railway mechanics, using instead carefully vague language about innovative defensive tactics and resourceful use of available materials. Fletcher stood at attention while the king pinned the medal to his uniform, shook the king's hand, saluted, and returned to ranks feeling mostly confused because he was being decorated for doing something that every railway brakeman in Britain would have understood instinctively. Twisted metal under load behaves differently than straight metal, and if you understand the physics, you can use that behavior to your advantage. The innovation wasn't the physics. Railway engineers had known about torsion mechanics for decades. The innovation was applying railway mechanics to tank tracks, recognizing that the same principles that governed freight car couplings could govern armored vehicle mobility. Fletcher spent the rest of the war training tank crews in mechanical maintenance, teaching them to recognize track wear patterns and stress indicators, occasionally mentioning the Dunkirk chains when students asked about his DCM. He served until 1945, was discharged as a warrant officer, and returned to Doncaster in September 1945 to discover that his old railway employer had gone bankrupt. The freight yards were half abandoned, and the post-war economy had no use for specialized brakemen with expertise in coupling chain mechanics. Fletcher spent 6 months unemployed, living on his military pension, before finding work as a maintenance supervisor at a steel mill. He worked there for 22 years, married in 1947, had 3 children, lived a quiet life that gave no indication he'd saved thousands of lives with twisted chains on a French beach. He never talked about Dunkirk except when pressed, never joined veterans associations, never attended the annual Dunkirk survivor reunions. His wife knew he'd been decorated for something at Dunkirk, but Fletcher deflected questions with practiced skill, redirecting conversations to present-day concerns and avoiding the past. Thomas Fletcher died on November 4, 1967, age 53, from a heart attack at his work desk in the steel mill. His obituary in the Doncaster Chronicle was 6 sentences long. Thomas Fletcher, maintenance supervisor at Sheffield Steelworks, died November 4th. He was 53. Mr. Fletcher served with distinction during World War II and received the Distinguished Conduct Medal for actions at Dunkirk. He is survived by his wife Margaret and 3 children. Services at St. James Church, Friday 2 p.m. The obituary didn't mention 340 disabled Panzers, didn't reference 338,226 evacuated soldiers, didn't explain that a significant portion of the British Army survived Dunkirk because a railway brakeman understood torsion mechanics better than German tank designers. Fletcher's medals went into a drawer at his home, his service records were filed in Army archives, and for 30 years the story of the twisted chains remained a classified tactical footnote, accessible only to military historians with appropriate clearances. The declassification came in 1997 when the British Ministry of Defense released a massive collection of Dunkirk-related documents for the 57th anniversary of the evacuation. Among those documents was Captain Morrison's after-action report from May 1940, describing in detail Fletcher's chain tactic and its impact on German armor operations. Military historian Dr. Sarah Pemberton discovered the report while researching improvised anti-armor defenses, recognized its significance, and published a paper in 1998 titled The Railway Brakeman's War: How Torsion Mechanics Saved the Dunkirk Evacuation. The paper detailed Fletcher's background, explained the physics of twisted chain obstacles, and calculated the tactical impact. Approximately 43% reduction in German advance speed, estimated 340 Panzers disabled or destroyed, and a direct contribution to evacuating 293,000 additional soldiers beyond pre-evacuation estimates. The British Army issued a formal recognition in 2000, 60 years after Dunkirk, acknowledging Fletcher's contribution and posthumously awarding him the distinction of honorary mention in the Dunkirk Evacuation Roll of Honor. Margaret Fletcher, Tommy's widow, accepted the honor at age 79 during a ceremony at the Imperial War Museum, accompanied by her children and grandchildren. The museum created a small exhibition about the twisted chain tactic, displaying one of Fletcher's actual chains, recovered from a French beach in 1947 during mine-clearing operations, alongside photographs, tactical diagrams, and testimonials from Dunkirk survivors. The exhibition text includes this assessment. The improvised use of railway chains represents one of the most effective examples of adaptive tactical innovation in modern warfare. Fletcher's recognition that civilian infrastructure components could be repurposed as military obstacles demonstrates the value of diverse technical expertise in combat operations. Modern anti-tank obstacles still incorporate the principles Fletcher discovered in 1940. Dragon's teeth, hedgehogs, and check hedgehogs all work by creating mechanical interference with tank tracks and suspension systems, using the tank's own weight and momentum to force obstacles into vulnerable mechanisms. Military engineering courses at Sandhurst teach Fletcher's chain tactic as a case study in improvisation, emphasizing the importance of understanding basic mechanical principles and applying them creatively under pressure. The lesson isn't use twisted chains against tanks. Modern armor has evolved beyond simple track-throwing vulnerability, but rather understand how machines fail and exploit those failure modes with whatever materials are available. It's a lesson that applies equally to railway mechanics in 1932 Yorkshire and tank warfare in 1940 France. The Sheffield Steel Works, where Fletcher spent his final years, closed in 1983. The building was demolished in 1985. Nothing remains except industrial brownfield and a small historical marker, noting that the site once employed over 3,000 workers during peak production years. Fletcher's name isn't on the marker. His grave at St. James Church in Doncaster is a simple headstone with dates and family information, no mention of Dunkirk or Distinguished Conduct Medal. But in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, in declassified tactical assessments from 1940, in the survival of 338th R's 226 evacuated soldiers and their descendants. In all those places, Tommy Fletcher's legacy endures. The railway brakeman who understood that metal under stress behaves in counterintuitive ways, who saw a problem that generals couldn't solve, who fixed it with 19 inches of twisted steel and saved an army in the process.